All right, so get this. We're going on a little trip back in time today.
A time machine for economics.
Exactly. And the reason, well, we're going to help you crush that big econ test coming up. Don't worry, though. We'll hit all the major stops from like way back in the Paleolithic era to the modern world.
And we'll make sure you really get those key concepts, not just, memorizing stuff, but really understanding it. Like economics is happening all around us every single day, right?
Totally. It's like even deciding whether to, I don't know, buy that new video game or save up for a car.
Exactly. Needs versus wants, limited resources, making choices. That's economics in a nutshell. And those ideas, they've been around forever. Speaking of forever, imagine living in the Paleolithic era.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Before agriculture and all that, I mean, wouldn't scarcity be like the biggest issue back then?
Absolutely. Think about it. You need food, right? But the nearest source is miles away, or maybe guarded by some rival group. So you're constantly weighing those risks and rewards. Do you cooperate to hunt, maybe go after bigger game, or try to snag some smaller prey on your own? Every choice has consequences.
Whoa. So like even back then they had to think strategically, economically.
Yeah, every decision mattered. And then boom, we hit the Neolithic Revolution.
Agriculture, that's the big one.
Massive game changer. Suddenly, you've got a surplus of food. Not everyone has to be out there hunting and gathering all the time.
Right. And so,
So some folks, they get really good at other things like making pottery, weaving cloth. They start trading these goods for food, and you start seeing settlements pop up, social structures getting more complex. It's like this revolution, it wasn't just about farming, it was about the birth of like more sophisticated economies and societies.
okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's all connected. And speaking of connections, what about those epic trade routes like the Silk Road? I mean, those always seem so romantic, camels laden with silk and spices. What's the real story there?
Okay, so those routes, they weren't just about camels and cool stuff. They were these huge, complex webs connecting empires. You've got producers, middlemen, people navigating tough terrain, even political drama.
Oh, for sure. And I remember reading about how the price of something, say peppercorns, could totally skyrocket depending on where you were along the route.
Exactly. That's supply and demand in action. The further those goods traveled, the riskier it got, and the price reflected that. Those early traders, they were basically pioneers of risk management.
Wow. So we've got these early systems that are evolving, right? But then Europe kind of kicks things into overdrive with the commercial revolution. What should I know about this for the test?
Think of it as the foundation for modern capitalism. You see innovations popping up like guilds setting quality standards for goods, trade fairs becoming these massive hubs for commerce, and banking systems starting to emerge.
Wait, banking back then.
Yep. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, these things made transactions way smoother and less risky. So instead of lugging around bags of gold, merchants could use these financial tools.
That's wild. So this is like laying the groundwork for everything we know about finance today.
In a way, yeah. But this growth, it also led to powerful merchant classes who started flexing their muscle in politics and reshaping society. It's not just about the money, it's about power dynamics shifting too.
I see. And this sets the stage for a much darker chapter,
Hmm.
mercantilism and the transatlantic slave trade.
Right. And it's a really tough topic, but super important to understand. So mercantilism was the main economic theory at the time, and nations were obsessed with hoarding wealth. They wanted gold, silver, and they wanted to export more than they imported.
So that meant colonies, right? They became like these sources of raw materials and then markets for the finished goods.
Exactly. And that set the stage for exploitation on a massive scale.
Okay, so in that quest for wealth and power, the demand for labor in the colonies exploded. But why were Africans specifically targeted for this horrific system?
Sadly, a bunch of factors came together. So you had European diseases just decimating indigenous populations in the Americas. That created this massive labor shortage. And tragically, Africans were seen as like more resistant to those diseases and skilled in agriculture. Plus, they didn't have established networks in the Americas, so escape was much harder.
So basically a combination of factors, along with the absolutely horrific dehumanization of Africans, led to the transatlantic slave trade.
Sadly, yes. Millions of lives were destroyed in this pursuit of profit, and it shaped global power dynamics and left scars that we're still dealing with today.
It's a powerful reminder that economics and ethics, they can't be separated. They're intertwined.
Absolutely. It's not just numbers on a page. This is about understanding a deeply troubling chapter in human history. It really makes you think, doesn't it? About the choices we make and the consequences, even centuries later.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of consequences, Let's shift gears to another period that totally reshaped the world, the Industrial Revolution.
Mm.
Not just about cool gadgets and factories. This thing really changed everything.
Oh, yeah, it was massive. And your textbook's right. It kicked off in 18th century Britain, steam engine, spinning jenny, all those groundbreaking inventions.
But why Britain? What made them like the birthplace of this revolution?
Well, think about it. They had a stable government, tons of coal and iron just lying around, and a growing agricultural sector.
So more food meant.
More food meant people could leave the farms and head to the factories for work. Plus, there was this, like, spirit of innovation, a real entrepreneurial vibe going on. It was the perfect recipe for industrialization.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, imagine I'm a farmer in, let's say, 1750s Britain.
Mm.
What's my life like as this whole revolution unfolds?
Well, picture this. You're living this quiet life, tending your fields, and suddenly, bam, new technologies pop up everywhere. Factories start offering wages, cities are booming with people looking for work. You might find yourself drawn to that, maybe end up in a textile mill, surrounded by the clang of machines, working to the rhythm of the factory clock. It was a whole new world.
Wow. Yeah, like exciting, but also kind of scary.
Definitely. Massive changes, both good and bad, incredible progress, but also tough working conditions and like society kind of struggling to keep up.
It's like a time of upheaval, right?
Yeah.
And is this where those big thinkers like Adam Smith and Karl Marx come into the picture? Their ideas seem so relevant to this era.
Oh, absolutely. Adam Smith, writing in the late 18th century, he saw the early stages of the revolution firsthand. And his idea of laissez-faire capitalism, basically letting the invisible hand of the market do its thing, really resonated with that entrepreneurial spirit.
So Smith's saying, let people pursue their own interests and competition will take care of the rest. Sort of like a survival of the fittest for businesses.
Yeah, you could say that. He believed that would lead to greater efficiency, innovation, and ultimately more wealth for everyone. Like the market, driven by self-interest and competition, would naturally regulate itself.
Makes sense. But then comes Karl Marx a bit later, and he's got a whole different take, doesn't he?
Yeah, Marx was watching the Industrial Revolution unfold, but he was focused on the dark side. The exploitation of workers, the widening gap between factory owners and laborers. He didn't see capitalism as this engine of progress. To him, it was a system built on squeezing profits out of the working class, who he called the proletariat.
So Marx is saying, wait a minute, this invisible hand is actually benefiting the owners, not the workers.
Exactly. He believed that this exploitation would inevitably lead to class struggle and eventually a revolution where workers would seize control of the means of production. His ideas formed the basis of communism, a classless society where everything's controlled by the state for the common good.
Wow, so we've got Smith on team capitalism and Marx warning about its downsides and offering up communism as an alternative. But there are more isms out there, right? Like socialism and utilitarianism. How do those fit in?
Oh, you're right. Those are big ones too, especially if you're prepping for that test. Socialism, in its different forms, tries to create a more equal society, right? It might involve things like the government owning key industries, strong social safety nets, or worker-owned cooperatives where employees have a say in how things are run. Think of it as trying to harness the power of markets, but with a focus on fairness and reducing inequality.
Got it. So not completely overhauling the system like communism, but tweaking it to be more just. What about utilitarianism? That one always kind of throws me for a loop.
Utilitarianism is interesting. It's not really an economic system itself, but more of an ethical framework. The focus is on maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people.
So like a cost-benefit analysis, but for society as a whole?
Yeah, exactly. In economics, utilitarianism might support policies like universal health care or a progressive tax system, where those who earn more pay a higher percentage. The goal is to benefit everyone, even if it means some individuals have to contribute a bit more.
I see, but wouldn't that potentially ignore the needs of smaller groups or minorities in favor of the majority?
That's one of the main criticisms of utilitarianism. Critics say that it can overlook individual rights in the pursuit of the greater good. It's a tough question, right? How do you balance individual needs with the well-being of society as a whole? It's a complex ethical dilemma.
Wow, this is mind-blowing. We've gone from like bartering for tools back in the Stone Age to debating the pros and cons of these complex economic systems.
And that's what makes economics so cool. It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about understanding people, choices, consequences, and the systems we build to deal with scarcity and manage resources.
All right, so we've covered a ton of ground here. It's like, All these isms, they're not just some abstract ideas in a textbook, right? They're like frameworks for how we organize society and make decisions.
Exactly. They're all interconnected too. Like they build upon each other, they react to each other. It's a whole web of ideas. Let's start with capitalism. It's the system that, well, pretty much runs the world today, right?
Yeah, capitalism. Yeah. Private property, free markets, the whole invisible hand thing. It's
Yeah.
all about efficiency, innovation, right? But it also gets a lot of flack for inequality. How do we square those two things?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, there's no doubt that capitalism has created a ton of wealth, and it's driven some pretty incredible progress. Think about medicine, communication, transportation, all these advancements, largely because of market forces. But the downside is that wealth doesn't always trickle down to everyone, you know? You can have massive innovation happening alongside persistent poverty, a lack of opportunity for a lot of people.
So it's like a trade-off, right? Efficiency and growth on one hand, but the potential for inequality on the other. Is that where socialism comes in? Trying to find a better balance.
A lot of people see it that way. Socialism, in its various forms, it's all about creating a more equitable society, right? It
Yeah.
might involve a bigger role for government in the economy, providing things like healthcare and education, or using taxes to redistribute wealth, create social safety nets.
So instead of just letting the invisible hand do its thing, there's a more deliberate effort to make things fairer. But wouldn't that, I don't know, maybe discourage people from working hard, taking risks, if they know their earnings are going to be redistributed?
That's one of the criticisms, yeah. Critics argue that too much government control can stifle innovation, you know? That people might be less motivated to contribute if they don't feel like they're reaping the full rewards of their labor.
Right. It sounds like finding that sweet spot, that balance is key. Enough regulation to ensure fairness, but not so much that it, like, chokes off economic growth.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky. What's the right level of taxation? What role should the government play in healthcare, education, providing a safety net? These are the questions societies are constantly wrestling with.
Makes sense. Okay, now on to communism. This one seems like the most radical of the bunch, right? Abolishing private property, aiming for a truly classless society. Is that even possible?
Well, communism, as Marx imagined it, it's this utopia, right? Where everyone contributes what they can and receives what they need. It's a powerful idea, especially if you see inequality as like baked into capitalism. But in practice, communist regimes have, well, they haven't always lived up to that ideal.
Yeah, I've read about historical examples where those governments became really authoritarian, like stifling individual freedoms and sometimes even creating economic problems, right?
Exactly. When you have too much centralized control over resources, you can end up with shortages, lack of innovation, even black markets popping up to meet people's needs. And without private property, well, people might be less inclined to invest, to start businesses. There's less incentive, you know.
Right, so while the goal, this idea of a classless society, it sounds noble, the reality of putting it into practice has been, well, pretty messy.
It definitely shows how complicated it is to design these systems. You've got trade-offs, unintended consequences. There's always a need to adapt, to try new things.
This has been an amazing journey from like bartering for spears back in the Stone Age to debating the merits of capitalism, socialism, communism. It's mind-blowing how these ideas have shaped history.
And they're still shaping the world today. As you're studying for that test, remember, economics, it's not just about memorizing definitions, it's about understanding people, their choices, the consequences of those choices. It's about the systems we create to manage resources and deal with scarcity.
It's like we said at the beginning, we're all living economics every single day. And maybe one of our listeners out there will be the next great economic thinker, coming up with new ideas, challenging the old assumptions.
I hope so. That's what it's all about, right? Keep those economic wheels turning. Never stop questioning, exploring, and learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a blast.
Thanks for having me.